There. I'm going to spend some time today talking about political competition in China. And before we dive into content, I want to start with just a reminder that if you are in my class, you hopefully have heard me say several times by now. It comes to us courtesy of the one and only cartoon character, Miss Frizzle from the Magic School Bus, and it is that you should never say never. I'm saying this right now because a lot of students, and actually a greater number of adults, when I say I am teaching a lesson on political competition in China, are really tempted to say that sounds like an oxymoron. There's no such thing. It's an authoritarian system. And if you want to say China is an authoritarian system and the possibilities of political competition are much more constrained than they are in our other 5 case study countries, that's all well and good. That's a defensible position to take. But it's not accurate, and it's intellectually lazy, and it's also not going to earn you any points on the AP CompGov exam if you say that there's literally no political competition in China. So I'm going to focus a lot on the constraints on competition, and it's important that you know about a number of the sources of constraints on competition in China, but it's not appropriate to say that there is literally no such thing, and that's a good general reminder for thinking and writing in AP CompGov. So let's start with the organization that has been the most successful at political competition in the last 70 years, and that's the Chinese Communist Party. So the CCP has an estimated 95 million members as of when I'm recording this, which is the summer of 2021. If it were a country, just the party alone, it would be the 16th largest country in the world. It's larger than the population of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's larger than the population of Turkey. It's larger than the population of Germany, although it's actually not the world's largest political party. That would be the BJP in India. The CCP just celebrated its 100th anniversary, so you'll be able to see lots of commentary on that from the outside world and lots of propaganda on that from the CCP's own perspective. About 7% of China's population are members of the party. So this is not an organization. This is a really, really large organization, but it does not encompass the majority of Chinese people. A couple of things to note about party membership. Number one, it's highly selective. It's difficult to get in. The process to become a member of the CCP takes a couple of years. It includes a written application. You have to go to study sessions. You have to meet with local party organizers. You have to actually engage in mentorship with somebody who's already a member of the party. There are written examinations that you have to pass, and you and your family members have to pass background checks in order to get in. They don't release, you might not be super surprised, this is not like the world's most transparent organization, so they don't release a precise acceptance rate, but in general, over the last 20 years, the ratio of applicants to the party in a given year to people who actually get admitted to the party, which is kind of the closest thing we can get to an acceptance rate, has fluctuated between about 8% and about 15%. From the individual's perspective, one reason to join the party, even in addition to ideological sympathy, even if you are not like the most enthusiastic true believer, it might still be worth joining the party because it's a path to upward mobility. Membership in the party looks good on a resume, and it's really, really helpful in gaining access to high status jobs. The overwhelming majority of people in high political positions working for the state in China are members of the Communist Party. And even in the private sector, it can be helpful to be a Communist Party member in terms of reflecting on your reliability, reflecting on your status, and also granting you connections to other well-connected people. Party members tend to be overrepresented in China's political and economic elite. From the party's perspective, opening membership to large numbers of people and making it selective is actually an important way of co-opting important sectors of society. And you can see that the party has been using membership admissions strategically if you think about how the composition of the CCP has changed over time. So for the first few decades of its existence, membership in the Chinese Communist Party was overwhelmingly dominated by workers and by peasant farmers. Those are the farmers in particular are the historical base of the Chinese Communist Party. And even going back as far as 1981, still about 63% of members of the CCP were either workers or farmers. However, as China's economy liberalizes, the party realizes that people working in the private sector, that people who have not traditionally been part of the base of support for the CCP, are going to become increasingly important and influential in Chinese society, economics, and politics, and that the party might need to broaden its membership in response. And that's codified in a policy that's rolled out under Jiang Zemin. He introduces it in 2000. The National Party Congress ratifies it, formally endorses it in 2002, called the Three Represents. What that policy says is that the CCP should represent three basic forces in society. One is China's advanced productive forces, another is China's advanced culture, and the third is, I'm quoting here, the fundamental interests of the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people. So what he's doing there, if you decode that language, is saying that the party needs to represent the whole of China, not just the working class, not just the peasantry. And as China is industrializing and economically developing, you can no longer just have a sampling of industrial workers and peasant farmers and say, well, this is the whole of China. And so the effect of that policy is to broaden the membership of the Chinese Communist Party to include entrepreneurs, to include people working in the private sector, and to include people who have a wider variety of class backgrounds. So in 2016, which are the most recent statistics I have available, only 37% of members of the Chinese Communist Party are workers or farmers. In today, there's rapid growth in the membership of entrepreneurs, of middle class people, of professionals like lawyers. In the membership of the party. And managers and professionals today are about a quarter of the party. It's also worth noting that members of the CCP are now much, much, much more likely than the general public to have college degrees. A final note on membership is that women are now about 25% and growing of members of the Chinese Communist Party, but they're still particularly underrepresented in its leadership positions. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to society in China. One major problem that the Communist Party has to manage, in addition to who gets in at the ground level, is the problem of elite succession. And this problem becomes particularly acute after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. He had left some instructions as to who was to succeed him, but there are really serious conflicts after Mao dies between different factions of the party with different beliefs about ideology, different beliefs about economic policy, different beliefs about whether Mao had gone too far. And because Mao's leadership of the policy had been so personalized, had been so vested in him as an individual and his personal decisions and opinions, there's not a lot of institutional mechanisms for resolving that crisis. So after a couple of years of infighting, Deng Xiaoping takes over, and one of his major reforms, I would argue one of his better decisions as a leader from the perspective of regime stability, is to establish a succession pattern. So Deng does two things. Number one, he actually designates his own successor and then that guy's successor. So he essentially makes it known that Jiang Zemin is going to take over after Deng exits leadership positions, and then that Hu Jintao is his favorite candidate to take over after Jiang Zemin retires. And both of those things end up coming to fruition. Those are Deng's immediate successors. A second thing that he does is to kind of establish this norm that he's going to hold leadership positions for about 10 years, and then he's going to step down. And then Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao also follow with this norm of holding their leadership positions for 10 years for those 2 5-year presidential terms, and then stepping down and yielding the way to the next person. And one result of this is that, or one additional way in which we start to shift towards institutionalized rather than personalized leadership after Mao Zedong's death, is that Deng and then Jiang and then Hu all come into office with less kind of personal authority than their predecessors. In particular, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao are honestly kind of boring guys. Their personal style is not nearly as charismatic or as electrifying as Mao's had been. They are widely regarded as technocrats, meaning that they are really concerned with pragmatic success and with economic growth, and they're less concerned with ideological purity. One last note is that the CCP has so far managed to balance different ideological factions within its membership and within its leadership when selecting people for elite positions. So often, if some people, there will be an attempt to balance between more populist people who are concerned with economic equality and providing a stronger social safety net versus more elitist factions who tend to be more interested in economic liberalization and economic growth. There's also some attempts when making selections for things like the Politburo or the Politburo Standing Committee to balance different regional backgrounds to make sure that at least most of the important regions of the country are represented within those elite bodies. So there is, long story short, the point that I want to underscore here is that the CCP is not an organization where one person can absolutely dictate what they want to happen, can just make any choice on a whim. It might have been closer to that model under Mao, but it is not like that anymore. There is competition for elite positions. There is really intense jockeying for power, but it's really hard for outsiders to observe it because all that competition happens behind closed doors, and the CCP is generally pretty good at minimizing leaks. I am going to add one asterisk here, which is that this trend towards institutionalization, this trend towards respecting the norm of regular succession and change of power, this trend away from personalized leadership, might be reversing itself under Xi Jinping. I think it's probably too soon to tell, particularly Chinese history, I think requires us to take kind of a wide angle view. But there's some indications that Xi Jinping is positioning himself to be more than just a 10-year long technocrat, particularly his abolition of term limits for the president in the Chinese constitution. And that's something to watch out for, which we will certainly talk about in class. Number two, a fun fact which always surprises my students is that China, while unquestionably a party state where the Chinese Communist Party calls the shots, is actually not technically a one-party state. There are 8 other legal political parties other than the Chinese Communist Party, and they are known collectively as the Democratic Parties, not to be confused with any party that's actually called the Democratic Party. The backstory here is that at the tail end of the Chinese Civil War, in 1948, there were 8 other minor political parties that declared their support for the Chinese Communist Party and that actually participated in some of the conferences that led to the founding of the People's Republic of China. And so they were accorded legal status, and in the really early years of the PRC, actually had some role in, participating in political decisions. Those parties were largely suppressed under the later Mao years, but they continue to exist legally, and they actually continue to have some representation in the National People's Congress and in these various minor state offices. So today there are 2,980 seats in the National People's Congress, and 885 of those are held by people who are not representing the Communist Party, who are members of the Democratic Party. There are 175 seats on the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, and 57 of those seats are held by members of the Democratic Party. So this is a little bit more than token representation, but there's 2 basic reasons to understand that these democratic parties are not going to pose a serious threat to the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Number one is that their leadership is actually vetted and selected by an organization of the Chinese Communist Party known as the United Front Work Department, which coordinates the party's relationships with other entities. And so these parties are not, entirely controlled by their membership. In order to become the leader of one of the democratic parties, you have to essentially have established that you are not going to pose a significant threat to the CCP. Number two, more generally, these parties serve primarily a consultative role. In general, they tend to vote with the CCP or with the CCP's leadership in the National People's Congress. So, for instance, when Xi Jinping pushed through the abolition of term limits and a number of other amendments to China's constitution, the Democratic parties voted overwhelmingly, maybe even unanimously, in favor. These parties are important ways of kind of funneling segments of public opinion up to the Chinese Communist Party. They can, in fact, make proposals in the Standing Committee, in the National People's Congress. They can suggest ideas through informal consultative mechanisms with the party. And so it's not true that these are like totally token organizations. They can actually serve the important function of delivering information and delivering opinions from certain sectors of Chinese society to the CCP leadership that it wouldn't otherwise be able to find out about quite as efficiently. But make no mistake, these parties are not seriously challenging the fundamental premise of CCP dominance. They have to accept that in order to get their role in the system. Third thing I want to talk about is civil society in China. So the theory of the Chinese Communist Party, particularly under Mao Zedong, is that the party can represent all interests, and so there should be no need for civil society. But in the reform and opening period after Mao's death, the party is going to kind of recognize we should expect some degree of citizen organizing to start happening as the general climate liberalizes a little bit, and we should figure out how we're going to manage the emergence of civil society. So the kind of old school approach to this is the creation of, I think, possibly the best or the second best acronym in the entire AP CompGov course, which is GONGOs. These stand for government-operated non-governmental organizations. They are not unique to China, but they do have a bigger role in China than in any of our 6 case study countries. these are sort of party-sponsored mass organizations. They include something called the All China Federation of Trade Unions. They include something called the Women's Federation, and there's lots of other attempts to kind of co-opt mass society in a way that can ultimately be managed and controlled and supervised by the party. So the Gongos are one way for the party to try and co-opt some of the energy that would otherwise go into forming independent civil society organizations. However, the state has also legalized more genuinely independent non-governmental organizations, and so you've seen, hundreds of thousands of organizations pop up around China. Legally, they are mostly restricted to doing work that is not political, but there are a lot of NGOs in China that operate, particularly on the local level, to directly provide services to the population. Remember, this is still in many ways a developing country, and the safety net is not nearly as expansive as you're going to see in a wealthier country. And so these NGOs provide services in things like education and healthcare and disaster relief and facilitating access for people with disabilities. And some of them do some important work, and the state might have an interest in allowing some of them to operate because they're going to fill in some of the gaps in the safety net provided by the state. However, the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state are constantly trying to make sure that they can manage the activities of these NGOs. That's the reason why the law restricts them from engaging in political advocacy. More recently, in 2016, a law was passed in China that really tightly restricted the operation of foreign NGOs, requiring them to have a local partner, requiring them to report regularly for government supervision. And so there's definitely some concern on the part of the state that these organizations, if left unsupervised, might turn to political work and present a threat to the state. In terms of civil society, from the perspective of the party state, a couple of threats that they might worry about in terms of regime stability. Number one, there's a huge number of unregistered non-governmental organizations in China. The state has kind of the right to crack down on them. Some of them, the state will just agree to look the other way because they're performing useful service. But the China's laws are written in a way that allow for crackdowns on NGOs when they get too political, so they have a tool to deal with that. A really major potential threat that has not materialized is the possibility, as a result of the reform and opening era, that this growing class of entrepreneurs and middle-class people who did not directly owe their prosperity to state employment might start calling for democratization. And this was like a hope that was widely expressed in the West, particularly coming out of the Cold War context, as China started to economically reform. However, as I've said already, the party is largely successful so far in co-opting these people by opening up membership of the party to them. And so we now have this whole group of people in China known kind of colloquially as red capitalists, meaning that they operate largely in the private sector. Some of them, in fact, are tremendously wealthy, and yet they have kind of established through either membership in the Communist Party or just declining to engage in political resistance that they are okay with this system. A specific organization that has attracted a lot of attention in the United States is a martial arts / spiritual movement known as Falun Gong, sometimes Falun Dafa. This was established in 1992 and started really rapidly gaining adherents. And as Falun Gong grew, the state started putting restrictions on its activities. In 1999, the Falun Gong organizes a mass protest in Beijing, where a bunch of people come out and actively demonstrate against the repression of Falun Gong by the state. And at this point, the state really comes down hard on the organization. They ban the sect entirely. They arrest about 5,000 of its members. There are allegations of torture and even of illegal execution. The organization did not start out as political, and it still today is primarily not a political organization. But this is a good illustration of China's unwillingness to allow mass organizations to exist independent of its control. And conversely, the persistence of Falun Gong demonstrates that the state does not have total control over people's associative activities here. Local protests, I think, are kind of undercovered in the international media when we're thinking about political resistance in China, but there's actually more than 500 protests a day in China, kind of dotted around the country. And a lot of these have to do with bread and butter issues that happen on the local level. Things like seizures of land illegally from farmers for development projects by local governments, things like issues of official corruption, different environmental hazards. High smog levels will often trigger corruption in major city or protests in major cities, terrible working conditions conditions and hours at factories. So you'll see unauthorized strikes, things like that. So you do see these local protests, and the authorities kind of have to decide whether they're going to respond with repression or with making some concessions and trying to buy off protesters or actually address some of their demands. And I think one thing that has really preserved regime stability in China is simply that these local protests have not yet coalesced, for the most part, into a major national movement. But if there's going to be a domestic threat to China's political stability, that possibility of local protests linking up and becoming national, I think, is something to watch out for. Um, One national social and economic issue that does have the potential to become explosive in China is what is known as the floating population. This reflects the fact that your access to a lot of social services in China is conditioned on your possession of something called a hukou, which is a household registration document, kind of like a domestic passport, which entitles you to access services like schools for your kids and housing and healthcare in the city or in the province or in the village where you are registered. There's a huge number, I think the current estimate is around 250 million of people in China who have domestically migrated in search of work. Most of these people are moving west to east, from inland to coastal provinces, and from rural to urban areas in search of jobs in China's growing factories. These people are essential to keeping China's economy running, but it's really, really hard to change your domestic residence in China. And so a lot of these people are effectively kind of disenfranchised in the major cities where they work and live because they don't have that residential, that residence permit. And so that's going to lead to these people who, can't enroll their kids in public schools, who can't get access to subsidized housing or healthcare, or any of the other social services provided by the local government where they live, in addition to often really, really difficult working conditions. And all of that could potentially turn into a serious source of instability in China. But again, it doesn't seem to have yet coalesced into a national political movement. So these are some potential places where we might look for civil society to become more active and potentially more destabilizing in China in the coming years. But it's not at all clear that any of them right now presents an imminent threat to the survival of the regime. One other thing, speaking about potentially destabilizing factors that the state has had to be really flexible in responding to, we need finally to talk about the internet. It is always, I think, redundant for me to tell high school students that the internet is really getting popular these days, but that is true in China as it is in most other parts of the world. Internet usage and particularly use of social media has just exploded in the last 2 decades in China. And some of the content that people are putting on the internet is, surprise, surprise, political in nature. Um, it's worth noting that there are a couple of social media platforms that were developed in China, whose primary user base is still in China, that are very active. So if you are on Twitter or if you are on Facebook and you're not seeing a huge amount of viral content originating in China, that part of the reason for that is because Chinese users tend to gravitate for a variety of reasons toward these domestic platforms instead. And two names that might be worth noting are first Weibo, which is essentially a Twitter equivalent. The old people term for this is microblogging. And then WeChat, which is essentially equivalent to WhatsApp. If you're familiar with that, you can do text and voice messaging over large groups. The state, predictably, has implemented pretty tight restrictions on internet use in China. The official term for this program is the Golden Shield, particularly pertaining to restricting access to websites originating outside of China. A popular term for commentators, particularly in the United States, to use is the Great Firewall of China. I personally hate this term because I think it kind of overstates the degree of blockage and understates some of the other important things that China is using. But the College Board says you need to know that term, and lots of outside commentators who do know what they're talking about use that term, so I thought I would throw it in there. A couple of tools that the state has for trying to restrict the possibility that internet use will turn into a source of political instability. One is just straight up banning websites and censoring posts and search terms. This is the kind of activity that's most directly and obviously invoked by the use of terms like Golden Shield or Great Firewall, and it's what outsiders most frequently tend to know about Chinese internet censorship. So there are some foreign sites, for instance, that are just outright banned in China, particularly Facebook and Twitter. There are some search there are some topics, there are some search terms, there are some keywords that are outright bans using using automatic filtering mechanisms. And there's also a huge amount of manual censorship because the government will occasionally publish lists of terms that are banned or that are discouraged. And there are an estimated 2 million people employed in China, not just by the government, but also by media outlets, by private corporations, to monitor opinion. And, an estimated 100,000 people work for the state just manually deleting posts from various parts of the internet. Um, Less widely known are other mechanisms for the government to exert pressure on internet users. One is by putting pressure on internet firms, on search engines, on internet service providers, on mobile phone companies, saying, hey, you really need to cooperate with our censorship efforts. You really need to ban X user. You really need to devote some attention to barring the use of these search terms that we're going to put out to you regularly as a condition of operating in China. So famously, in 2006, Google launched a search engine in China, Google.cn, that censored results. So it would cooperate with the party state in trying to block users from viewing certain results that were banned in China. This was immensely controversial in the United States. Google ends up pulling out in, I think, 2010. But lots of firms, just given the size of China's market, really are under intense pressure to cooperate with the state's restrictions and preferences regarding censorship, regarding internet access. And that's especially true, of course, for firms that are actually based in China, some of whose CEOs are actually members of the Chinese Communist Party. One last thing that the state does, and this is the least widely known outside of China, I think, is to actively encourage pro-government content. This originated in a 2004 policy directive where the government called on universities to start recruiting people to post pro-government comments online. And these people are sometimes derisively known as the 50-cent party because they are allegedly paid 50 Chinese cents in order to make comments that support the government or attack the critics of the government. There are also, as is the case in basically any bureaucracy that's aware of the internet, state organizations, party organizations, local government, local officials are really encouraged to have an active online media presence. And then, of course, there are plenty of volunteers who just genuinely agree with the agenda of the government and are very active in promoting their points of view online as well. It is important to note the Chinese state has a huge amount of resources dedicated to kind of shaping the content of the internet, in addition to more blunt force censorship. But it's important to note that this doesn't mean that it's totally impossible to access politically controversial or banned material in China. And Chinese internet users have gotten pretty good at finding workarounds, like using VPNs to make it look as if the computer's not in China, using kind of coded language and puns. The Chinese language is really, really friendly to puns, to try and evade censors and avoid using those terms that they know are going to get them automatically blocked. So there's this kind of constant cat and mouse game between government censors and internet users to try and gain this freedom of expression. But it's definitely more difficult in China than it is in countries that have more aggressive regimes of protecting civil liberties online. I will leave it there, but I hope that I have given you enough information to understand both why political competition is really constrained in China and why it nonetheless does exist. Never say never. I'll see you next time. Thanks.